Professor Shi, Professor Ke, colleagues and friends. On behalf of the Dean of the Advanced Studies in Humanities and Social Sciences, Professor Sebastian Liao Xianhao, who is unable to join us today due to an important conference at the National Sun Yat-sen University, I full-heartedly welcome your presence here. And Professor Liao wished this session a big success, and I believe it will be. And secondly, as a less than qualified student of Professor Shi, I once had an invaluable chance to visit Professor Ke at the University of Manchester in, I think it's 2004 or 2005, when Professor Ke taught in international relations at the Manchester University, and we had a brief but concise and inspiring discussion about the Chinese philosophical idea about how the world is organized, the idea of Tianxia. And since then, I continue to pay attention to Professor Callahan's publication and critiques and reflections about Tianxia, which is also an important concept of the developing school, of the so-called Chinese School of International Relations. But the pity is that I didn't know Professor Callahan also do a lot of studies about the sensible politics, a kind of very new issues. But I am also fully confident that this kind of issue is in accordance with the interest and vision of our institute, which emphasizes and promotes the dialogue and conversation between different disciplines. Lastly, I would like to thank Professor Shi and the Department of Political Science, which provide generous support logistically and intellectually for the success of this extraordinary session. So let me move to Professor Shi, who will formally kick off and begin this session. Let's give him a big applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for being here and introducing Professor Callahan on behalf of the chair, who has been left nothing else to say. I know Bill for a long time, right? I think it's in Budapest when we first met. He stopped me in the hallway telling me when he was making food. That was 25 years ago. And since then, he has changed his affiliation several times. And I'm very happy to see he's now affiliated with London School of Economics. President also get a degree from there. Today, Bill's going to talk about his newest book. I don't know how he wants me to introduce him, because he has so many publications. 10 books, or even more than that, and lots of articles. Most of them very provocative. Most of them are very critical also, critical of whatever he finds being the dominant force at the time, that he wants to make sure that everyone understands the untold story of hegemony, and he's able to reveal all the constructions and the important ways of control that most people don't get to see, especially people who study international relations, being trapped and stuck to this sovereign system. The book you have in hand, which I just passed, is his topic for today, is visualizing international relations. We already visualize something there. I hope the presence, physical presence of Professor Callahan here today at NTU will bring us not just inspiration, but also a long-term future of cooperation.
Okay. Thanks. Well, thank you, Professor Shi, for your very generous and warm introduction. I've known you, actually I've known you before I met you in Budapest, because I've been reading your books like throughout the 1990s. It's like, I finally got to meet you, so I was very excited. And I'm still very excited to be here because you're, of course, one of the leaders in the field of critical IR and thinking of new ways of doing international relations that either critique the state-to-state system or go beyond it or go underneath it or go beside it. So I'm very happy to be here. And thank you for helping me and sponsoring me to come to Taiwan and the National Taiwan University. I also want to thank Wang Chunyuan. I don't know if she's still here. She's in the political science department. She does a wonderful job of helping stupid foreigners like me figure out how to do things. So yeah, I want to thank you. I want to thank the Department of Political Science for hosting me. I want to thank the Institute for Advanced Studies and Professor Chang for kind of being a part of this as well. And for just giving me an opportunity to talk about my new book. I'll go down there in a second because that's where all my slides are. But I guess I want to say I'm going to talk about the book, Sensible Politics, Visualizing International Relations. And I just decided I wanted to take advantage of this event to get some feedback on something new. Because it's one thing to present something that you've already written. If people tell you got something wrong, it's like, oh well, whoops. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my present project, what I'm doing here as a Taiwan fellow, which grows directly out of that book, but does it in a different way. It's more focused on China and Asia. So I'm looking at the visual global politics of how Chinese views of the world shape its worldview. So it's playing with it's the same in Chinese as in English. So worldview is 世界观, and view of the world you could say 观世界. So what is the difference? How are these things interwoven? The sort of abstract notion of a worldview and the very concrete practice-orientated way of looking at 看 观世界. I think I'll just go over there, if you don't mind. Bring my water with me.
When you're walking over, I just remembered, I forgot to introduce the two discussants.
Right.
We are very lucky to have two discussants who Professor Callahan used to criticize. Now we get a chance to revenge them. One of them is Professor Yang Chu from Chungo National University, Chunzhou, where we have the best Korean food. He has been also teaching international relations for over 10 years, right now. Almost 10 years. And also Wang Yijie, or you can call him Jay, he's from London University, also teaching East Asian and international relations there for 15 years, 10, 12 years. Both of them have a long way to go. We're very happy to have both of them here to be the discussants of Professor Callahan's talk. Bill, please.
It's a theoretical book, but it argues its points through analysis of controversies that are familiar to international relations and area studies specialists, such as violence and refugees in Syria, the South China Sea disputes, the Great Wall of China, gardens in China and Japan, and the global politics of surveillance, especially right now in Xinjiang. And I analyze these examples to think about the relation between the verbal and the visual, between meaning and feeling, between the iconic and the everyday, and between the West and the non-West. It's trying to do Asian studies, but in a new way. One of my previous books, for example, China, the Pest Optimist Nation, I use Western theory, kind of post-structuralism, to explain Chinese politics. But this book isn't about China per se, it's about visual IR. It's about how China, but it's also about China in the sense that I'm using Chinese examples to think about global politics, using Chinese and Asian examples to explain general IR principles. So rather than using Western theory to analyze non-Western examples, I'm using theories from the West and Asia and examples from Europe and China to think about global politics. Let's see. The book explores two analytical strategies, which I call the social construction of the visual on the one hand and the visual construction of the international on the other. And I'll explain them by discussing a set of maps. This is actually 3 maps that I pieced together. A set of maps called, quote, Europe in 2035, unquote, that were published in 2012. So this is an example of futurology, using maps and cartography for futurology. It uses, I argue, visual images not simply to represent the world or represent an ideology, but to do something, to make something, to creatively make a new regional order and perhaps a new world order. The maps generally show many European nation states fracturing along subnational lines. Some countries expand. So Ireland, which I have a kind of a feeling for, because it's where my ancestors come from, is actually reunited in this. Last time I gave a talk about my book, it was to Leiden University, where Ray is from. And I noticed that the Netherlands on this map is swallowing up part of Belgium, the Flemish part of Belgium, and on and on. Everybody sees something in this map. It really provokes a lot of discussion. And most importantly, Russian territory grows to include much of the former Soviet Union. So Foreign Policy magazine concluded that these maps show Putin's geopolitical fantasies. And the maps actually predicted Russia's annexation of Korea in 2014, 2 years after it was published. Of course, it's easy to dismiss such maps as unscientific fantasies that are merely propaganda. And when we deconstruct the maps, this is what I mean by the social construction of the visual, deconstructing the map. We can see how Foreign Policy magazine was actually duped into broadcasting to the world the fake news of right-wing propaganda from Russia's top tabloid, Express Gazeta. But it turns out that the Russian tabloid, Express Gazeta, is not the original source for these maps. If we keep digging, we find out that they first appeared on a popular Ukrainian website. And while the authorship of the Russian tabloid article is anonymous, the author of the Europe in 2035 maps on the Ukrainian website is a young writer named Igor Lezhev. So whereas Foreign Policy magazine presented this as a sober analysis of Europe's future that is based on interpreting secret Russian intelligence sources, when we dig down, we find out that these Europe in 2035 maps were actually created by a Ukrainian horror novelist. That's one of the things this guy does. He writes horror novels. He's not a security studies person. He's not a spy. He's not an academic. So although Foreign Policy magazine thinks these maps are the official plan for Putin's preferred world order, it's probably more likely that they're a prank. You know, he's pranking people. So here what I'm using, what I call the visual visibility strategy to understand how images are important, not just because of the content of their meaning. We also need to consider how their meaning is constructed by the who, when, where, and how questions of the image's production, distribution, and viewership. This strategy is important because it enables us to speak truth to power by revealing power relations, the power relations behind the image. The book argues, though, that it's not enough to deconstruct images. And it says that the impact of maps, these maps and other maps, the impact is not limited to empiricist questions of their scientific accuracy. Is it inaccurate? Is it reflecting the truth or not? Or the hermeneutic questions of their secret hidden sources. To me, the maps took on weight and influence not based on their truth value or their ideological value, but as they circulated around cyberspace. First in Russian language networks through the online tabloid newspaper, and then around the world again through Foreign Policy magazine's English language online article. And if you kind of trace it, you see it's popular in Russia because it was mobilizing people in elite and public opinion who longed for a new Russia, for kind of the Soviet Union, for the greatness of the Soviet days. And at the same time, it was important in the West because it mobilized different segments of elite and public opinion that are concerned about this kind of resurgent or irredentist Russia. In both cases, it underlines how visual artifacts can mobilize people, not just rationally, but emotionally in what I call affective communities of sense. So I don't read Russian. I mean, I got a Russian student to help me kind of dig down the source of this, but I don't treat this as a text. And I don't see I don't see a lack of Russian language ability as a problem, because it's not about the language to me. It's about, oh my God, the Basque country is independent here. Isn't that interesting? And so that's what I mean by people are responding to these visual artifacts, not just rationally, but emotionally. People responded viscerally to what they saw rather than rationally to what they understood or what they read in text. Critical inquiry here changes from asking how the image is constructed, which is the visibility strategy, the social construction of the visual strategy. It switches to ask how does it make people feel? How does this map make you feel if you are Spanish, for example? Because images can viscerally move us in unexpected ways, they need to be appreciated, not just in terms of their ideological value, but also in terms of their affect work. Not just what they mean, but also how they make people feel, both as individuals and as collectives. The Europe in 2035 episode also shows how almost anyone can make a map. Anyone, including a young Ukrainian horror novelist, can make a map that does things, that changes things, that provokes things. These are provocative maps. Here, provoking new social relations between Russia, Europe, and the US that go far beyond the intent of any particular actor. We don't need to look at what Igor was thinking. We just need to see how people are reacting according to this approach. This odd episode shows how visual images can work in non-narrative and non-linear ways to construct social relations by provoking emotions. So for some people, they see these maps and they feel pride, they feel awe. Other people might feel fear, and still others might feel hope. I mean, these maps are very pregnant with meaning, provoking meaning. And I think that these emotions aren't something that we need to write off to explain away as irrational and therefore not interesting, important. I think that these emotions themselves are political in the sense that they're performances, that they are people doing things that are important. In this way, the Europe in 2035 maps work performatively to create new visions of social order and world order by provoking new effective communities of sense. So these are communities, they're communities of sense through visual in this case, but they're also effective communities of sense, because the community of sense is not just a rational thing, it's an emotional thing. So I'm putting those three kind of ideas together. I do similar things, similar analysis in each of the chapters. First, I deconstruct the images to reveal their hidden ideological meaning here, like, well, the source of this is very different from what we thought it is. And then second, I tried to show how we need to go beyond textual analysis to see how visual images can provoke new social orders and world orders. Usually at this point, I'd go on and talk about another chapter, which is my maps chapter. I like a maps chapter. Maps are my most popular articles and chapters. I love maps. Everybody loves maps, so I usually talk about that. And in this book, I discuss how, kind of, where the heck did we get this 9-dash line or U-shaped line or whatever. This is from the 2012 passport from the People's Republic of China. They decided to put not just a map of China on their visa page, but a map of China with the U-shaped line. And what I'm doing is, in that chapter, is thinking about how early modern maps can help us to explain Beijing's claims to the South China Sea in the 20th and 21st century. And the argument is that we need to see maps not just as passive representations of the world, but maps as active agents that provoke world politics. So I call it mapfare. So we have warfare, we have lawfare, where you use law for strategic purposes, and I'm talking about mapfare, where we use maps for strategic purposes. That maps do things, that they do things politically, they do things diplomatically, but they also do it through the kind of emotive, the affective, and the aesthetic that I talked about a moment ago. And this is just, again, a taster of what I do in that chapter. First, I look at the upper left-hand corner. That's a Korean Tianxia or Chonhado map. That to me is a great example of sort of the ideology of the Sinocentric world order of consent. You know, China's at the center of territory, but China's also the center of civilization. And the world is organized around concentric circles. And then I look at the bottom left map. That's what I call a lost territories map. That's a map from the Song Dynasty, a very famous map from the Song Dynasty, called the Map of Civilization and Barbarism, Huaitu. And what it's about lots of things, but to me it's about the Southern Song Dynasty kind of imagining how to reconquer the North from the Jin Dynasty. And I relate this to maps of lost territories in 20th century China. And just in a nutshell, my argument is when you put together this sort of this concentric circles expansive view of China with this idea of lost territories, you get things like the 9-dash line, because the line is like a concentric circles way of thinking of things, and the argument for people who are persuaded by this map is that it's a lost territory, lost to Western imperialism, to Japanese imperialism, that needs to be reclaimed. So I'm not making the sort of arguments that you usually find in discussions of maps in the South China Sea. I'm not actually saying that these maps are evidence for or against Beijing's claims to sovereignty. What I'm trying to do is think about the way of thinking, the kanfa, the sort of where these kind of strange maps come from. And when you kind of trace it to these very famous maps. So I'm not digging up new maps. I'm looking at maps that are iconic in Chinese and East Asian societies to think about how these maps shape the way people think about the world. It's from chapter 7 in my book, and there's also a photo essay, a much shorter photo essay on my website, sensiblepolitics.net. So you can go and look at that for free anytime you want. But what I decided to do today is to use my time to talk about my kind of latest ideas, which I said is sponsored by the Taiwan Fellowship and hosted by the Political Science Department here at Taida. And so it's called Visual Global Politics, How Chinese Views of the World Shape China's Worldview. And so the idea behind this project is to appreciate Edward Said's arguments in Orientalism about how the West, how Europe, didn't just conquer the Middle East, it governed the Middle East culturally by creating the idea of the Orient. And the Orient was a good way of governing people not just through force and coercion, but through participation in a hierarchical system. So that for the West to be strong, the East, or the Middle East in this case, has to be weak. So what I'm doing is looking not as China as a victim of Western representation, but what happens when China's important? What happens when China has power? How does China or Chinese people represent the rest of the world as a friend, as the foreigners, represent foreigners as a friend, a comrade, an enemy, and at times a barbarian? So today, I'm going to discuss the international politics of appearance, of image, by looking at 3 sets of visuals of noses. On the left is a Tang Dynasty image of a barbarian with a particular kind of nose. In the middle is a Chinese propaganda poster from the Korean War, which has Americans with another kind of nose. And then on the lower right is from a Chinese language textbook that discusses the cosmetic surgery industry in Taiwan today, and how Asian people are changing their noses and why. So I thought this is just I guess is what I like to do. I like to put together weird things and see if they make sense together or not. I hope you'll tell me whether they make sense. I'm actually, since I'm here in Taiwan, I'm actually first writing this essay in Chinese as a way to kind of think through it. And my Chinese title is actually much cleverer than my English language title. The Chinese title is 外表政治与外交政治从唐代到当代. So what I'm trying to do here is play with the rhymes of these phrases, but also how what I'll be arguing is that there are rhymes in these images, what you could call visual rhymes, and that rhyming is an interesting and helpful way of thinking about political relations in these images and other images. So very quickly, the Tang Dynasty is commonly seen in China as the apex of its civilization, as Shangshi, the best of times. And it's also seen as the most cosmopolitan time in Chinese history. The story goes that many Han and non-Han people mixed in the Tang capital, and that the emperor actually employed many of these foreigners from Central Asia, West Siyu, the western regions, as entertainers, traders, and warriors. They were the people, they were his personal guard, was made up of these Central Asian barbarians. So how did cosmopolitan Tang Dynasty see the world through its images of other peoples? Tang images of barbarians, this is, I mean, I'm very careful. This is after a lot of concern, a lot of thought and concern and thinking about how other people talk about it. That seems to be the best way to translate Huren here. Huren is barbarian. Tang images of barbarians typically had deep eyes and a high nose. And this actually produced a literary term, Shenmu Gaobi, deep eyes, high nose. And interestingly, we usually think in terms of 20th and 21st century where the options are very limited to either you reject foreigners and either you conquer them and reject them, or you accept them, but they have to convert and be just like you. You have to be Sinicized, you have to be assimilated. Interestingly, these barbarians weren't assimilated into Tang Chinese life. Rather, they were valued for their difference. The deep eyes and high noses showed them to be ferocious warriors, especially, I guess, in the previous one. This guy, you know, this is the opposite of a Han Chinese at that point. He is bare-chested. Han Chinese at that point all wore and didn't take off clothes, even their tops. He has a big beard, not a kind of a thin beard. He has a big nose and he has deep eyes. So this is sort of the He-Man warrior type. Whoops. And so the deep eyes and high noses showed them to be ferocious warriors, which of course comes in handy for people who are hired to protect the emperor. So these representations kind of show the valued qualities that the emperor liked. He didn't want to become them, but he wanted to use them. Barbarians thus were included in the Tang Dynasty, but not as equals. They were part of a hierarchy of peoples, or hierarchy of what we now call races, where they had their own particular role. They had their own particular role and own particular use, and they couldn't go beyond that. Their careers were limited. If we jump a few centuries, 13 centuries to the Korean War, we can see that noses are also very prominent in CCP propaganda posters. Again, these noses don't simply exclude the other, the Westerner in this case, but include and exclude them, exclude difference in particular ways, again, for particular reasons and for particular projects. Russian allies, as you see on the lower left, are like the Tang Dynasty barbarians. They're valued as strong warriors that will protect China, and which can be seen in their very high nose, especially when you compare it with the Chinese sailor who's, of course, next to the Russian sailor who's smaller, has a flatter nose, and it's just a very hierarchical, interesting hierarchical relationship there. American enemies, of course, if you look on the lower right, do not have a high nose, but a big nose. Actually, I just learned the difference between a gaobi and a dabi like a month ago, and it fascinates me, this kind of difference between a high nose and a big nose. Maybe I'm overemphasizing it. Please tell me if I am. American enemies do not have a high nose, but a big nose. And this is a particular kind of big nose. It's a hook nose. And it's an image that comes from, among other places, it comes from Nazi propaganda in the 1940s. It's an anti-Semitic stereotype of Jews as kind of capitalists and foreigners and bad people who have blue skin. Here it's an American who's a bad person with blue skin. I mean, this poster is actually part of a campaign to fight American biological warfare in Korea. Of course, there was no biological warfare in Korea, but there's a huge cache of texts and posters sort of fighting American biological warfare. Anyways, that's why a rat is jumping out of the guy's mouth. So this was made in the 1950s during the Korean War. The image above it is from a manhwa, a comic book, from 2001 that was on sale in China. And again, it shows foreigners as blue-skinned, as evil demons, not alive. I didn't get a good picture. I didn't get a good example of the nose, but it's amazing how you can't see the guy's face, but oh my gosh, you can see his nose. His nose is like really big and sticking out from under his helmet. Anyway, my thought here is that, and especially, so the PRC is aware of is aware of Nazi propaganda because they have a swastika on the head of the American. So you can't say, oh, well, they just didn't know what they were doing. That's often a common response. So to me, this is kind of an amazing thing where the PRC is recycling racist Nazi propaganda in the 1950s to stereotype Americans as kind of evil capitalists and conspiring. Like Jews in the Nazi era, Americans here are blue-skinned, big-nosed devils who must be exterminated like rats. Okay, so through the nose, I think we can see China's racial hierarchy of good and evil Westerners. That the Russian allies are good and they have a certain kind of nose. American enemies are bad and they have a different kind of nose. And to me, this was confirmed because if you look at the propaganda posters in the 1960s, after the Sino-Soviet split, the images of Russians start to have big noses, not high noses. So their noses change depending on what the regime thinks of their country. Okay, so on the other side of the Korean War, at the same time, there were many casualties who needed reconstructive surgery for their faces. So these are civilians and soldiers from the US, the UN forces, from South Korea, from North Korea. So there was a lot of, it was just a horrible war, and there was a lot of need for facial reconstruction surgery. And the story goes that an American military doctor pioneered new plastic surgery methods during the war and treated hundreds of patients. And then he commercialized it for ordinary Koreans. And so this is quite interesting that the kind of plastic surgery industry in Korea comes from American military doctors. And so it's actually, when you read this now, when the guy was writing in the 1950s, it was one thing. When you read it now, it's amazing. He said his purpose was to de-orientalize the Koreans. So it's like, wow, wow. So not surprisingly, plastic surgery, especially in East Asia, is a big issue for feminists, for post-colonial scholars, and for various critical IR people who kind of now say that getting a nose job, it shows this sort of noxious, this bad, this horrible combination of military imperialism from the American military doctor and cultural imperialism from sort of the American-style beauty being spread around Asia. But what is also interesting is that a researcher did her PhD, a researcher from South Korea wrote her PhD studying plastic surgery in Korea as a political performance. And she argues that rather than see people in the present day in Korea, and I would argue in Taiwan, rather than see them as victims of ideology or victims of cultural imperialism, we need to give them more agency to explore how and why they get plastic surgery. She also shows that plastic surgery has moved far beyond carving Western features onto Asian faces. That, so it's not just kind of making people look Western. She argues that so at the end of surgery, she does interviews with other Koreans, and she asks them how they look or what they look like, they don't say Western, or they don't feel that they look Western. They just look like a Korean who's had plastic surgery. So it's no longer, according to her, tied to some American or Western influence, not directly anyway. She explains, she argues that, so she puts this in a political economic context and says that after the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the government and business didn't take care of people anymore. You didn't have a job for life. You didn't have a welfare state. And in this neoliberal era, everyone is responsible for their own fate. And people, she says, are changing their faces to become more attractive, to improve their chances on the job market and also on the marriage market. And this is actually the same thing, this is what the dialogue says in the Chinese language textbook from Taiwan, that it's a rational thing to improve your chances by getting a better nose and better eyes and better chin. Interestingly, the arguments go beyond crass materialism to show what you could call cosmic power. Many Koreans and Taiwanese believe that your face reveals your cosmic fate. And thus, there's whole kind of disciplines that study this, physiognomy in English, or mianxianshui, mianxianshui in Chinese. So people are now getting plastic surgery to actively take control of their fate and to change it for the better. Change your face to change your fate. To me, this goes back to the Tang Dynasty, because the arguments about the meaning of the Tang Dynasty images of barbarians also are about cosmic fate. It's not just about getting a big burly guy to protect the emperor. They also saw a close relationship between material face and cosmic fate. And that barbarians, it's argued, were useful for the material protection of the emperor, but also, as the images show, they were useful for the emperor's cosmic fate, both in this world and in the next. So how are Tang art, Korean War propaganda, and nose jobs related? So I'm not, as you can probably tell, I'm not actually arguing that there's a direct causal relation between one and the other, or any of the three. Instead, I'm interested in how images resonate with each other, how images rhyme, that there's similarities. It's not the same, but there are interesting similarities across centuries and they resonate among different countries. So the Tang Dynasty and the Korean War rhyme in showing Chinese images that govern the other. On the one hand, they exclude evil difference that has a big nose, and then on the other hand, they include useful difference with a high nose. Tang art and cosmetic surgery, as I just said, rhyme in their kind of entanglement of the material and the cosmic, where people can change their fate by changing their appearance in both Korea and Taiwan. To me, this whole kind of analysis probably raises more questions than it answers, but it gives me some clues for understanding how China and Chinese images can govern the world or govern Asia. But it goes beyond this, any notion of a sort of Chinese Occidentalism. I think it's, as I keep saying, we need to understand China's worldview through the study of how Chinese artists, surgeons, and physiognomer, and people who read your fate, how they view the world, including the cosmic world. So as the cosmic surgery example shows, this is not just an exploration of the top-down politics of reading official representations. I think we need to get beyond questions of representation and authenticity, such as the search for an authentic Chinese alternative IR theory, or the defense of an authentic Asian nose. We need to get beyond these to see politics, the site of politics, as a site of creativity, where people can do politics by creating statues, creating posters, and even creating new noses. In this way, we can look beyond IR as official state-to-state relations to see how popular culture and personal experience create global politics. Okay, so that's my kind of latest research. If I have 15 more minutes, I can go and just finish up with my kind of third thing. So back to my book. The third example that I'll discuss today goes beyond images as sort of looking at artifacts and buildings and spaces, to look at the multi-sensory politics of walls, especially border walls like the US-Mexico barrier, the Great Wall of China, and the Berlin Wall. It also deals with the question of how area studies can address international relations problem of Eurocentrism. It's a very big problem in IR right now. And actually, if you look at a lot of the visual IR research, it's pretty good at addressing the Eurocentrism issue because it often involves, or usually involves, a robust critique of Western images of the non-Western other. There's a lot of papers about Western images of people in Afghanistan during the Afghan War, for example. My concern is that Eurocentrism is not simply about content, it's not simply about the global hegemony of Hollywood. I think that because Eurocentrism is also about theory and method, where the quote West is method dominates discussions of Asia as well as of Euro-America. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, it's very common that the West will provide the theory and Asia will provide the case studies. So how can we address this Eurocentrism of theory and method? One response is the sort of thing that I do it sometimes, and people in this room also do, is to reverse the East-West power dynamic to see China or Asia as a site of ready-made alternative theory. For example, it's popular to represent China's Tianxia system, all under heaven system, as an alternative to the Westphalian system. But rather than replacing Eurocentric theory with Sinocentric theory, in my book, Sensible Politics, I aim to explore visual IR through an assemblage for a group of concepts that are Chinese, Asian, Islamic, Western, traditional, and contemporary. The goal here is to use Asian concepts, practices, and experiences as a critical juxtaposition to decenter the critical IR discourse that tends to generalize from Western examples. The book stresses how Asian visual images can provide important concepts and tools that help us to understand sensible politics beyond Eurocentrism. Since my interest is in Chinese politics, the analysis often starts from there. So as a student of China's global politics, I've been perplexed and interested in the popularity of the Great Wall of China. Why is the Great Wall of China so popular? Why do people love the Great Wall so much? And this interest in the politics of walls became even more acute when Trump announced his goal of building a wall in 2015, 5 years ago. So in Sensible Politics, I use the concepts, practices, and experiences of the Great Wall of China. I use kind of the theory of the Great Wall of China to rethink Trump's wall. And I made a film called Great Walls that asks, why do we hate Trump's wall and love the Great Wall of China? The film and the book chapter both look to the Great Wall to help us shift from the dominant view that sees walls as exclusive barriers, that kind of inside-outside divisions that are ideologically bad or even ideologically evil. Switch from that to appreciate walls as gateways, places that you pass through, as sites of performative experience that is morally ambiguous, or even in the Chinese case, it's seen as walls are morally good. So it's amazing to me how the PRC continues to celebrate the Great Wall as a morally good thing that represents their, quote, defensive foreign policy, unquote. Even though most people see Trump's wall as bad, it actually is the same thing as the Great Wall. You could say it's a defensive foreign policy. It's not expanding America. It's trying to keep out a certain group of people. But it's interesting that with Trump's wall, it's bad, whereas the Chinese wall, somehow it's good. So I think the Great Wall, if you kind of think about it as not just an image, but as a theory and as an experience, it's an important part of Chinese foreign policy. If you've ever been to a Chinese embassy, you'll notice that there's always a picture of the Great Wall in a prominent place. That the PRC's gift to the United Nations is a huge, huge silk portrait of the Great Wall that hangs in the UN headquarters in New York. The image on this slide, to me, is fascinating because it shows a Chinese ambassador to Pakistan giving this huge Great Wall silk tapestry to Pakistan, okay, in 2014. And importantly, it's not in the Chinese embassy. It's one thing if they have a Great Wall of China in the Chinese embassy. As this picture shows, it's not in the embassy. It's actually hanging in the entrance hall to Pakistan's own foreign ministry. So like the Great Wall is colonizing Pakistan in this image. So here we see the Chinese ambassador is very happy to explain the benefits of the Great Wall to his kind of less than excited Pakistani counterparts. I said bewildered, I'm not sure. They're not smiling. The point here is that the Great Wall does at least two things. First, it serves as an ideological barrier between civilization and barbarism. So that map of the Tang Dynasty, map of civilization and barbarism, has the Great Wall on it as well. And you can see the map on you can see the Great Wall on most early modern or medieval Chinese maps. And we can also understand this, let's see. Second, the wall works as a gateway. So firsthand, it is a barrier. We can't get around that. A wall is a barrier that marks a clear inside from an outside, and it's a morally problematic barrier. But second, we can also see the Great Wall works as a gateway to provoke emotions, to do things, and to bring people together in effective communities of sense. So here I question critical IR's focus on self-other relations and its focus on inclusion and exclusion to rethink global politics in terms of creative processes of social ordering and world ordering. The wall, to me, creates a world order as a boundary between civilization and barbarism, but it also creates a social order through the cultural exchange that happens at the wall's gateways. Okay, so that's my kind of theory of the Great Wall. And in my work, I applied this critical view of the Great Wall to rethink the US-Mexico wall, both as a barrier that creates ideological division and as what I call an infrastructure of feeling. It's not just military infrastructure, it's infrastructure that makes people feel things, that not only separates people, but brings them together in celebration and protest. So that's what you see here. This is the US-Mexico border in Arizona. On the left-hand side is Mexico. On the right-hand side is the US, and they're playing volleyball. Every year they have a volleyball at the wall celebration. So it's a celebration that's also critiquing and protesting the wall, but they're doing it in an active and fun way. So this, let's see. Yeah, so I made a film about it. I made 2 films, actually, a 28-minute version, which is published in an academic journal. I can give you the link. It's for free. It's useful if you want to spend a whole class talking about the wall. You can just show my film and let the students talk about it. It works. But this year, I decided to try something new. I wanted to not have a 28-minute version, which is nice and academic with long takes and lots of images and explanation. I wanted to target a different audience, like teenagers who are like on TikTok and on YouTube. So what I did is, through a friend of mine who runs a filmmaking company, I hired an 18-year-old to redo my film. Olaf is his name, Olaf Lawrence. I hired him to do a 3-minute remix of my film to make it not just short, but sharp. And we'll watch that, hopefully, if it works. And I think that the sort of the audio, the sound, because Olaf composed some new music and just did a radical sort of re-edit of my images. That I think his editing works to highlight kind of different reactions that people have to walls. So let's see if this works.
Physical, tall, powerful, beautiful southern border wall.
I grew up in a suburban utopia that had no walls. It was actually illegal in my town to have a wall more than 3 feet high. But seeing walls as either morally good or morally evil makes me feel uneasy. Walls certainly are built to exclude people, but I want to explore how walls become a site of experience. When it comes to walls, I think of the Great Wall of China.
Well, firstly, you have to go to the Great Wall. Everyone, all the students you get taught, without trying to
It's so incredible to see a man-made structure that just meanders through the landscape, through the mountains.
If you have a blue sky, if you look at the Great Wall and the sky merging together, it seems like a way to heaven.
In 1961, the East Germans built what they called the anti-fascist wall. And it was a personal experience for both common citizens and world leaders.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
For Trump, the wall is ideological and it's personal.
We will build a wall. We will build a wall. We will build a wall.
The wall becomes a wall through personal experiences and political stories.
Who's going to pay for the wall?
So I think about walls in a slightly different way, as gateways to intense experience for both ordinary travelers and elite political leaders.
They'll pay. You know what they'll pay? Again, these politicians are like sounding boards. John, what do you mean? These are people I know. What do you mean by
Okay, so just to sum up, my book and the films aim to decenter our understanding of social theory, of international politics, and of Asian studies. First, by expanding from the verbal to include the visual and the multisensory. Second, by expanding from Eurocentric investigations to a more comparative area, to a more comparative area studies approach that looks to Asia and the Middle East. And third, by shifting from critical IR's focus on inside-outside and self-other relations to see politics in terms of creative processes of social ordering and world ordering. Yeah, so if you're interested in more about it, you can either see the book or go to the website, which is kind of introduces the book and has some other things on it. Anyway, so that's it. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to our discussion.
Doesn't matter, so why don't we have then Professor Cho from Chunmoo University to start this discussion.
All right. Hello everyone. Thanks for become discussant of this panel. Actually, to be honest, I read this book on pre-publication draft 1 year ago, and then for this function, actually, I read the introduction, and also, in fact, the Bill, he published a short article about his book in the EIR. So I read, so I need to have some kind of promotion too. So if you're interested in this kind of essence of his book, probably you can read go to EIR, and you can find the short version of the article. Okay, so without further ado, I just brief. I think it's 5-10 minutes if you know for me. So just
You have 30 minutes.
I can't. I have not anything to discuss now. Okay, for me, recently actually there are three very interesting academic trends in critical IR scholarship. The first one is actually the aesthetic term in IR, which interpret the political and the intentions through various cultural sites like films and cartoon. And that is the first the trend. And second trend is about going beyond Eurocentrism. So, and while looking for the alternatives, and then there are different approaches that are called, sometimes people call it the non-Western IR, post-Western IR, post-colonial IR, global IR, the project of worldling. Some people, they use the term, ontological term, decolonial IR. Of course, they in a sense, they are different. They share, they are critical of Eurocentrism, but in fact, they are different, actually. Ontological, global, they're different. And the third trend is, for me, recently, I felt left rise of feminism and green theory. People who care about the environment. So they think that the IR should include not only humans, but include nature too. So I can see these three trends in critical IR scholars. And then the sense of politics, this book actually, I feel it adds to the first, the aesthetic term, and the second, going beyond Eurocentrism, the theoretically empirically. So as Bill discussed, actually, theoretically, he presents very new framework that is visibility and visually dynamic. Sometimes difficult to pronounce that. Visibility and visually dynamics. So I think that we are somehow familiar with the visibility strategy, which is thinking visually, which I think that strategy is close affinity with the post-structuralism area. So try to interpret the text or the visual text. But there's other of strategies, the visuality strategies. Bill, he mentioned in the book the feeling visually, which talks about affect. Because now, outside IR, the sociologists, they're talking about the affect. It's difficult to explain. Affect means more like emotion. Affect means, for example, it's not only about representing, when you enter a temple or church, we have bodily feeling. That is affect. So it's very multisensory feeling. It's affect. So sometimes we make decisions based on affect. In many cases, actually, from my point of view. Of course, we have rational thinking, we have reason, but in our daily life, sometimes we make decisions on the basis of our emotion and then the affect. So I think that the concept of affect is still very fresh and new in IR discipline and perhaps everyday IR. So for me, I think that we need to take this affect seriously, because in modern social science, the rationalism and reason receive more importance than emotion and feeling or affect. But again, in everyday life, I think that in practice, the emotion and feeling are there more frequently. And even I think that as far as the way I understand Confucianism also kind of value kind of emotion than the rationality. I think the kind of more like kind of to kind of, how can I say, sages should cultivate the people who can have kind of very sophisticated emotion rather than kind of to make kind of very logical judgment. Okay. Then implicitly the sense of politics also examine very unusual side which are kind of multi-sensory artifacts, such as the book actually discussed the garden, the map, and also clothes, the walls, and so on. So through this kind of very unusual side, we can sense different social ordering and world ordering, and actually the bill shows the Chinese, the passport, I think the visa, the map. Actually it shows that China they try to show the different social ordering and world ordering. So this ordering is, for me, is like a deconstruction, but at the same time it's a reconstruction kind of. They try to reconstruct something by deconstructing existing kind of thinking. So considering this order-making multisensory artifact in sense of politics, so alternatives or alternate forms of life are just around us, because actually Bill's kind of text, can I say text artifact, it's just around us. It's kind of around us. So in fact, the alternatives or alternate forms of life is actually, we can find it around us, although we cannot sense easily, because due to very hegemonic discourse or kind of stereotype kind of thinking about something, and our kind of very conventional thinking. So I think it also indicates a very feeble distinction between theory and practice in social science, because if the artifact actually to kind of suggest different social ordering, world ordering, if we sense the artifact differently, the thinking is actually doing, and the doing is the thinking actually. So here, I think the distinction between the practice and theory is very, very kind of, in a sense, very arbitrary, because by sensing something, we can realize alternative social ordering, world ordering. So that's actually is doing from my point of view. And also, I think that the sense of politics seeks to open the critical door for new conditions of possibility. Actually, many kind of critical theories, they try to open the new value for the alternatives. So in fact, the sense of politics is doing the same things. But at the same time, kind of through that door, the sense of politics see how the alternative social orderings and all the orders are visualized in the present. Then he talks about the tension and the different kind of orders. And then again, Bill kind of criticize that new ordering or new social ordering or old ordering. So for me, kind of there's a deconstruction, and then there's reconstruction, and there's another deconstruction about that new ordering. So I wonder whether it's still kind of is under kind of big umbrella of post-structuralism, because it's, anyway, the main goal is kind of continuously we need to deconstruct kind of ordering. So and then also the one interesting thing is that traditionally the power control and the produce the meaning by saying that what is right, what is wrong, what is correct, what is incorrect. But today's world, the power actually control and produce the feeling, actually making, from my point of view, affect theater. Affect theater is from kind of, okay, the Trump, he set up the bill and he showed the bill. He's not talking about it's right or wrong sometimes, but he showed the bill, the wall. Itself is, for me, is affect, kind of, he tried to produce affect. So, but in order to produce affect, the person or the entity, they need to have a lot of resources, because it's very difficult to produce affect with the limited resources. So now actually the power can produce effect to control kind of actors. So in this case, probably to say this kind of thing is affect governance. It's also, you can say, sometimes we talk about cultural governance resistance, but there might be affect governance. So I saw the affect governance in Korean society. I can see actually in Korean society, even domestic kind of politics. If I go to Korean apartment these days, there are a lot of big walls to show that this is wealthy area, this is poor area. So that wall itself is kind of, rich people can build that kind of wall. So they can afford kind of to produce affect, to make distinction between the kind of poor people, rich people, and the poor kid and rich kids. So, and then even kind of nowadays populism is rise. The populism actually, people sometimes they don't think very rationally with the reason, but they follow the feeling and then the emotion. So the culture, I think, the affect governance maybe become more popular or more kind of unpopular. So I wonder, is there any kind of very effective tool or the kind of way of resisting that kind of affect kind of governance? Okay, let me start here.
And it is also a great honor for me to be able to discuss Bill's his latest books here today. Because Bill, actually, he was actually my the PhD external examiner decades ago, and yeah, I did my PhD in operations. Thank you for giving me a PhD, and I think I'm still deeply indebted to you for all your kind support. And I'm also very happy to see Bill in person today in Taipei. And I like these books a lot. I think the books actually successfully demonstrates how the visual IR is important, and also how it is different. And also it expands the critical gaze to consider how visual artifacts and also the sensory space can shape international politics. So for those who is working on critical IR, I think this book is a must-read book. So my question to Bill is, I think revolve around one of your main points. So in this book, because in this book you can your works actually go beyond Eurocentrism, and it's different from the Eurocentrism. So and also in your presentation, I think you also address these concepts in the end of your presentation. But I still I'm not sure if I understand what you mean by Eurocentrism. So I would like to ask you to maybe elaborate in more detail on what you mean by Eurocentrism. Because if I understand you correctly, I think your understanding of Eurocentrism actually refers to the excessive, the focus of criticism of the West in critical IR scholarship, right? So as you said, I think you wrote in your books, but also in the presentation. So you said so much visual IR addressed the issue of Eurocentrism through the robust critique of the Euro-American image of the non-Western IR. And you also said the critique of the Western universal cannot produce any new universal theory. Therefore, I think what you, so you believe, so we should also examine the East in the same way, critically examine the East in the same way. And since critical IR scholarship characteristically generalize from the Euro-American example, so you claim your books actually mainly focus on Asian example. So in other words, I think what we're trying to do in these books actually is to equalize the distribution of the critique of image of the West and non-Western, so as to avoid the problem of the East-West, the binary opposition. And in this book, you use many different examples to illustrate these points. For instance, you have your documentary I saw before. So you asked why is everyone fascinated by the Great War of China, and why in the meantime strongly criticizing the idea of the U.S. the Mexico barrier war proposed by Donald Trump. And also in this book, you also use movies. So you use actually so you use Zhang Yimou's film, The Great War. So you are actually so just like the Hollywood film, actually they normally portray the East as like a backward, dirty places. And your books try to show actually the Chinese movie actually doing exactly the same things. And so like you said, like Matt Damon actually he was presented as like a dirty and greedy things. So if I understand you correctly, I do have the following two further questions. So I think the first question is, so how do you address the power inequality between the West and the East? I think there's good reason why critical IR, critical analysis actually dominates by the deconstruction of the Western visual image. I'm thinking how many people have watched movie like, for instance, like Lord of the Rings and Rain, all the bad guys in the movie. So basically, actually, all the dirty, greedy, the people from the Oriental East. And how many people have watched the Zhang Yimou's His Great War? And also, why the central periphery, the logic of the Chinese Empire marks is indeed, like you argue, visually shaping Chinese the current world ordering projects. So in comparison with the world maps based on Westphalian system, I wonder which one is more influential. And so this is my question: how do you address the power inequality between the West and East? And my second question is, I think why I totally agree with you that the Chinese and Asian visual image and artifacts actually were imperial performance. And that's the Chinese and Asian alternative are not the emancipation from the Eurocentrism. I was wondering, should we allow the alternative world of the non-West as to become the sources of resistance against the Western dominance? So, because I myself, I'm Foucauldian, so I think actually, I think you are right. The resistance to the form of domination actually produce another form of domination. So there's the relation between the resistance and domination can always be easily reversed. However, but if you follow this, I of course Foucault's this is actually a dilemma he faced, because if we follow this, then we might think actually any kind of resistance will become automatically pointless. So, but I think in order to have a meaningfully the challenge to the Western hegemony, I think should we allow the non-Western world to have a side of agencies? So can we use the Chinese and Asian visual image and artifacts strategically for the time being? So just like Spivak's, his idea of a strategic essentialism. So I think the essentialism is wrong. But when the domination is overwhelming and essentialism for united front building actually is right. So this is actually my 2 cents. And so once again, I would like to stress this book is really a fascinating work. I recommend everyone to buy these books, not just to read the article from the EIR and my colleagues Yong. And I think the books really offer the unique approach to politics or war politics, which allows us to think critically about critical IR. And I truly enjoy reading it. Thank you very much.
Yang Chul, thank you for your comments. Oh, okay. At the end, you were talking about how to resist what you called effective governance. I like that. I like effective governance, beyond cultural governance to effective governance. And what I suggest in my book is that the way that most critical scholars and journalists have responded to Trump and to a lot of things the Communist Party of China is doing is to do basically a fact check, to say, oh, they're lying, and then list their lies. And that works for a certain group of people. It works for me some of the time. But as we've seen in both cases, it actually doesn't work that well over time, especially when the lies just pile up. You know, I guess the Washington Post has thousands of lies. So it becomes normalized. So this is why I think it's important to move beyond a textual analysis, whether that means analyzing a text of Trump or Beijing or Islamic State, to creating things, creating artifacts, whether it's writing a novel. I know you're studying a novel, a Korean novel right now, whether it's studying poetry like Roland Bleicher and other people do, or whether it's knitting. Some people are knitting their way to peace, or collaging their way to resistance. For me, the way I do it creatively is by making short films, documentary films, that don't just try to say that, like in the case of the film you just saw, that Trump is wrong and someone else is right, but to kind of explore the feeling of it. That's why it's important to go to rallies for Trump or for Ronald Reagan or for whoever, to feel what's going on, but then to do some counter feeling, to construct some other, people playing volleyball at the wall, for example. And so that's what I'm trying to do, and it's very, for me, it's still quite difficult to do. It's difficult to explain a non-narrative, non-linear way of doing things in a linear language. But yeah, it's more about playing with images and with artifacts than with dealing with a deconstructive critique that kind of takes the text seriously and deconstructs it and reconstructs it and deconstructs it again, as you said. No, I try to do both. I mean, that's what I try to do in the film. That's what I try to do in my book, is not just throw out everything that's come before, but to recognize what it can do in terms of textual analysis and critique of the West, but also recognize that it's not enough, that there's other things that need to be done. So thank you. I've forgotten that I was your external. You're trying to can set up a power relationship here where the student is now in charge. But that was 12 years ago. That's a long time ago. A very good dissertation, so congratulations again. Sure, I've talked to, I guess not directly to you, I've talked to you in my head through Young Chul, because we've discussed this a bit. And your basic question is, talking about Chinese ideas of world order is useful because they can undermine the hegemonic Western or American or Westphalian view, and is it not the time to give a critical view of Asian alternatives? I guess as you're asking the question, it made me think of kind of where I'm coming from. So most people who study China only study China. And you can have a great career just studying China, even Chinese IR. But because of social relations, I lived in Bangkok for 5 years and did the Thai thing and spoke Thai and lived in a big Thai family. Lovely people. I look forward to seeing them again if COVID ever lets me. But it also gave me another sense of not just this East-West or America versus China, but like where does Thailand fit in? Where does Southeast Asia fit in? Where do other non-Western countries fit in? And so I'm always cognizant about how Thailand and other countries kind of figure in these Chinese alternative world orders, and it's invariably as a colony. So my thought is, why would Thais sign up to this if it just makes them a colony? How is this a normative alternative? And I think that since, I guess this is the, I should, supposed to visualize. As a Foucauldian, I'll do a counter-Foucauldian or a respond in a Foucauldian way to your Foucauldian critique, is that it's all about relations, as you said, and you kind of pick which site that you're going to evaluate power relations. So in your site, you're dealing with this sort of broad view of imperial and post-imperial modern world, where Europe and America were on top and colonized the rest of the world. And that's fine, and that's great, and I engaged in that critique as well. But where I'm located in this book is somewhere else. I'm located in a place where China's PRC's power is growing very quickly, and its power is not just economic or political, it's cultural and effective. And there's a huge budget for multi-sensory artifacts. Some of them are effective, some of them aren't, but it's just there's an enormous amount of time and money being spent on it. And I find that very, very few, I mean, I can probably count them on one hand, of people are interested in combining a sort of a critical IR view to talk about China. Most people talk about criticizing the West and offering an Asian alternative. And I think that that's what I can do. It's a place where I can use my skills. And I think I guess it's interesting and important. It's not the only way of doing things. You could say that I'm in a position of relative seniority and power, and I should be careful what I do. But I guess that's my response, is that we need to have more critical analysis of sort of norm production in Beijing, and to point out what it does and what it doesn't do.
Now we invite feedbacks from the floor. Any comments or questions? I'm sure there are many. Please.
This is a very interesting talk. Thank you, Bill. And I think I have comments rather than questions. Well, you were doing research about the nose. Did you already have the article yet or not yet?
About nose?
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's, I did it like 10 days ago.
Oh, God.
And I'm still writing the Chinese paper. The Chinese, it's a 3,000 character paper, so if you like it and can suggest a place to publish it, I'd be happy.
Oh, sure. We're going to talk about this later. But it actually related to my research about, I called it like the anti-China emotion in Mongolia. And one of the authors, well, the person noted, Frank in his research, he actually mentioned that Mongolian were trying to differentiate themselves from Asian, not just Chinese. So the way they do it is actually using the so-called biological method, including to emphasizing how Mongolian has looked differently from most of the Asian, which is way more difficult because, most of you know how Mongolian look like. But it actually looked just like Asian. But they would just emphasize the details, including the details of the faces, like the height of the nose, and like the shape of the eye, even the skin tone, even like the body, how the body looked differently from Asian. But on the other hand, they try to link themselves with Russian. They're trying to tell the world that how much Mongolian had been so alike, or you can even tell them that, well, you're part of Russian, it would make Mongols like super happy. So they would, on the other way, emphasizing the character, not the shape of the body or the way the face looked like. They were emphasizing, for example, like the personality. Like Mongols are as general as the Russians. And of course, they didn't say, well, there's also a criticism of Chinese character. And they were emphasizing like how much Mongol can drink, like a Russian. So, which is a very important standard that for them to categorize themselves like Mongols. So, I mean, this would be a very interesting way also to like look at, because you're doing a comparison between the Westerners, the general define the Westerner and Asian, right? But maybe, well, just a suggestion, would that be interesting to see what they are trying to symbolize as well? Because from the Korean example, it's very much it's the way of colonization, right? Through the artificial, like a human-made new faces. It becomes kind of like a reshape the standard of the so-called beauty. I feel that's a very interesting idea, though. So that's my first comment. And the second comment is actually related to Yang Cho's comment to you. I'm recently doing the research about the so-called emotional turning IR. So that there already been 2 books published in 2018 and 2019 talk about methodology, that how could we apply emotion in our research in international relations. One of the articles, oh forgive me, I just don't remember the topic of the book and those other chapters, but the author was trying to differentiate the term affect and emotion. And I kind of appreciate the way that he defined the differences of affect and emotion. Affect, well, according to this author, is something is kind of subconscious. So it's like when we look at a picture, it's a feeling that we couldn't even talk. There's no verbal way to describe it. And this type of feeling, subconscious one, that he called it affect. But emotion is something that we can describe, like I feel happy, I feel angry. So this is something that we can use narrative to make it, to reformulate it, and to make it possible for us to analyze. I'm kind of wondering that when you are talking about the visual image, that how visuality can bring the impact to the real international politics. I haven't finished reading the books yet, I apologize for that, but do you kind of trying to analyze how could we, is it possible for us to measure the effect of what you define as a visuality, the power of visuality?
Hi, thank you. Thank you for reading my book, or starting to read my book. I look that you says Frank BA, is his stuff or your stuff as well on Mongolians? That's fascinating. No, I look forward to reading that, and how the kind of Waibiao, the outward appearance and the personality are ways that Mongolians talk about themselves to differentiate themselves. That's fascinating. When I started studying affect, 6 or 7 years ago. And one of the first things I realized is that, oh my God, I can't really understand this. It's argued at a very high level, and people spend a lot of time differentiating between affect and emotion. Although you described it very well, I wrote it down very quickly about how that emotion you can describe is sort of conscious, whereas affect is subconscious or preconscious. And to me, what was interesting about affect, rather than emotion, is that it's not just something that you feel as an individual. It's something that connects you to other people. The affect is about moving you. I mean, gandong, move you in English or in Chinese. It's the emotion moves you, or the affect moves you. It moves you and connects you. So that's actually what I'm really interested in, is feelings like Yongchul said, when you go into a church or you hear the national anthem or you see your child for the first time or whatever, where you just feel something that can be overwhelming and indescribable. That's what I find fascinating. And that's what I find fascinating about sort of the rallies, political rallies. As for measuring it, in the book, I don't try to measure. I'm not, I guess I just don't go there. Affect is still something that I'm working to understand, and it's an important question about, well, why should we care? So it's there, but why should we care, and what can it do? I talk about what it can do in certain examples in the book, but that's something that I'll have to think more about and develop more and read other people who are talking about it. Okay, thank you.
The reason I decided to come today was because I find your attempt to blend IR with affect, or the visual, is rather provocative, because my own project is looking at the affective politics of the LGBT movement in Taiwan, and how the movement is not just about sort of fighting for same-sex marriage or whatever kind of rights it might be, but it's actually an affective community. And it's a community that's also very closely connected to the politics of Taiwanese identity, writ large. So I myself am working through affect as well, and I think it's important to point out that there's a lot of different theorists of affect. And so in cultural studies, which I'm in, affect is widely debated, as you're aware, and people have lots of different definitions of affect. And I also apologize, I have not read your book, but I flipped through it. And as you were talking, I looked online through the University of Melbourne's e-copy of your book at your bibliography. And I've noticed that you reference a lot of cultural theorists like Sarah Ahmed, like Brian Masumi, people like Deleuze and others. And so I'm kind of wondering, since I haven't read the book, but I've seen in your bibliography who you're referencing, how you're, one, because you used the word assemblage at one point in your talk today, and obviously assemblage in kind of the original sense comes from Deleuze, right? And so how are you using assemblage in the book? And when you also talk about infrastructure of feeling, emotion, affect, and so you just kind of responded to Professor Huang's question, sort of defined or differentiated a bit. But I think particularly in cultural theory, affect and emotion and feeling, these are all quite different. So I'm wondering, in your work in IR, are you kind of blending the two? Are you taking, because you do reference Masumi, he has a very particular precognitive view of affect. And so I'm just kind of wondering where you stake yourself in that, or both in terms of affect and in terms of assemblage.
Brian Masumi's work is my main point of contact with affect theory. And then a friend and colleague, Emma Hutchinson, wrote about affective communities 5 years ago. And I guess what I do is I use affect. I follow Masumi in dividing kind of experience into ideological and affective. And ideological here means much more than communism versus capitalism. It's just like the whole kind of rational project to him. That's all ideology. And affect is everything else. So that's how I use Masumi, is that, using that distinction. And I also, that's where I get my understanding of affect about moving and connecting people, because that's one of his main arguments. I don't think it's worth my kind of limited time and space to go into a big argument about the difference between affect and emotion, and just say that there's in the book I say there's an argument there and here's where you can find it. I'm not going to stick a claim in that, because that's not the purpose of my research in that particular chapter. For assemblage, it's just the Deleuzian sense of just a bunch of things that are smushed together in a rhizomatic way, not in a hierarchical way, more horizontal, hierarchical. I've been watching, what do you call it, Star Trek Discovery. So that's all, that's very Deleuzian. It's an amazing Deleuzian thing. If you're not watching it, it's on, if you want to understand Deleuze, you need to watch Star Trek now, let's put it that way. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. So it's about assemblage. Yeah, I'm using it I'm using it in a very standard way. Thank you.
My name is Joyce. I'm here as a Chinese art historian, and I was interested coming to this talk because my research interest also relates towards in that I'm also interested in the depiction or iconographic sources of ethnic other in Chinese art. And I'm also interested in how the viewers in the past receive these images, so on the effect level as well. My questions for you are that I wonder which art historical writer have been very influential in the shaping of your visual politics thoughts, and also I wonder whether you have come across Dr. Mark Abraham's book. He is trained as a Tang historian, and he has a book published in 2008 called The Ethnic Identity in Tang China. There's also another Song Dynasty historian called Don Wyatt. He has written some very interesting books on Chinese people's portrayals of the blacks in Chinese history, and I thought that might be very useful in your development of this the physiognomy angle.
Hi Joyce, I hope we can exchange cards because I would love to talk to you some more. I really want to talk to you about, because there's only a couple people who are looking at the depiction of ethnic others in Chinese art, so I hope we can get together and talk. Let's see. The person who has influenced me the most in this book and in my understanding of the visual is Bill Mitchell, or William Mitchell, at University of Chicago. And he has written 3 or 4 books over the past 20, 30 years, which have been, each of them is just a milestone. And he's the person who really made me think of my analytical framework, where I juxtapose the social construction of the visual on the one hand and the visual construction of the social on the other. So he says that in one of his famous articles, but he never really develops it. So I'm like, thank you, Bill. I'm gonna take that and develop it. And so yeah, he's an amazing guy. I mean, I've never met him. We just share the same nickname. Yes, Mark Abraham's book, that's my source for the Tang Dynasty images of the Huren. He also published an article in an edited volume which is more, I mean, it's the same as his chapter, but it's more focused on the visual politics. So yeah, And yeah, I've just, I haven't read John Wyatt's book, but you know, it's on my reading list because that's probably going to be another one of my chapters, is how black people, or the color black, is what it does in Chinese art history and in Chinese images up till now. Yeah, so thank you for suggesting those sources.
I think I'm quite mainstream, so maybe I could not be so correct to comprehend what you presented, but may I make this kind of a distinction when we mention something more rational or logical is more about the mainstream or Western or Eurocentric approach of international relations or politics. So alternatively, when we mentioned about your suggestion of a sensible, which is more about audio or visible things, which open a gate or an opportunity toward a non-Western or post-Eurocentric approach of international relations or politics. But after further reflection about this kind of binary distinction, I feel that actually both the so-called logical and the visible things are all sensible. So when we suggest sensible politics, it is actually another new universal approach to address the issue. Thank you. But what is universal is what we need to resist. So quite, I'm just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's a good question. Like a lot of people, I say that I'm not trying to be universal in criticizing universals. And I try to, and the way that I do that is to not propose like a new theory of politics that looks to visual or multisensory things to replace the text base. I don't want to do that. And what I do is so rather than having this sort of high theory of rational or post-rational or structuralist or post-structuralist, I try to develop what some people call medium theory, medium level theory, but also medium in the sense of kind of media of communication. And so I don't have theories. I try to develop a bunch of concepts. And some of the concepts are quite simple. One is framing. What does framing mean? To me, so I teach a class in visual IR where students learn how to make a documentary film in 10 weeks. And one of the first things I do is just go like this. So this is a frame. That's what you have to do when you're taking a picture or making a film. And it's a political action to decide what's inside the frame and what's outside. I mean, who's inside the frame and who's outside. And that's ideological, that's politics. And throughout the book, I kind of develop different concepts, but I do them in pairs, like inside, outside, civilization, barbarism, thinking, feeling. But I argue that I'm not presenting these as binary distinctions of it's either thinking or feeling, but that they are in a relation, or they're in tension, that thinking and feeling speak to each other. And civilization, you can't have civilization without barbarism. And I do that throughout the book, and each chapter, more or less, kind of plays with a distinction. So for maps, I don't do the inside-outside, because that's very kind of Westphalian way of thinking about maps. I talk about, what do I talk about? Center and periphery, and the sort of distinctions and how you can have a center without a periphery. And so when I talk about clothing, women's clothing, it's about revealing and concealing. Revealing costumes in beauty pageants are generally revealing, whereas veils, Muslim veils, are generally concealing. But there's always a tension between them. Because one person wrote that when a woman wears a burqa on the streets of Paris, on the one hand, she's concealing herself because you can't see her face or her body. But on the other hand, she's hypervisual because she's there, and oh my gosh, in Paris or London, it's obvious. So that's the sort of thing that's how I kind of deal with theory, and I hope that resists sort of the urge to universalize. And yeah, I use concepts when they're useful, and when they're not useful, I discard them. Thank you.
We might be able to entertain another question if you have. Could I ask you to connect visuality strategy to virtual reality? In the sense that you need cultural preparation for people to be actively involved in vision. And this requires cultural preparation. And cultural preparation is not unlike piles of lies you read in Washington Post that people get too used to it or not even energetic enough to retrieve what's before those piles of lies. So you have virtual reality, and that prepare certain vision to be effective. There's a lot of vision. School art. So just, have you think about this connection?
Have I thought about the connection between visual politics and virtual reality? Yes and no. One of my chapters is about surveillance, but particularly on the internet, but also on the street through the sort of omnipresent cameras. And I guess what I do in there is talk about, and use the Chinese case, talk about how it's fine to talk about the Great Firewall of China as a barrier, and it works as a barrier quite effectively. You have to work quite hard and spend a lot of money to jump over the wall. People do it, but studies have shown that most people don't, and most people are happy. I mean, the person you had here last year, Florian Schneider, his book says that most Chinese people are perfectly happy to be within the sort of Chinese intranet, and it meets all their interests and needs. But I also, in my book, go on and say that what's interesting about this sort of next generation of surveillance seen through social media and through the social credit system that's still being built, but we can tell what direction it's going, is that it's not just the state telling you what to do or what not to do. It's not just the state telling you what to see or not to see. It depends on your active performance. So it's like performing, that you have to perform surveillance on yourself and on other people. So it's not just you as a citizen telling on other people who are doing things that the government doesn't like. You're self-surveilling too. And that's a very different dynamic, and the politics of that works differently. And again, we have to not just it's very common for people to dismiss young people for being stupid, for participating in these social media things when they're giving away all of their data and giving away all of their privacy. rather than just criticize them, in the chapter I tried to look at, like, what do they get out of it, and why are they doing it? And one reason they're doing it in China is because they really don't have any other alternatives. If you're not on Weixin, you can't do anything. But I also just say we need to understand these as a performance, and what do these performances do, and why are they so popular? And if you think they're a problem, which I do, you have to think of a way of addressing them that is more than just saying this is bad, or this is wrong, or this is fake. You have to think performatively to counter it. And I think that gets to what you're saying about the sort of how people can be, how certain views of the world can be normalized through virtual reality and deep fakes and whatever. It's a very good question. It's very frightening. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today, and hopefully you'll come back, and I'm sure there are people waiting to talk to you afterwards, and you can exchange comments. We want to hand it on, and maybe you can have a view afterwards. Thank you very much for coming here. That's good.
Okay, thank you.